Behind the starched dresses, glittering salons, and polished gestures, there was a suffocating secret. The Victorian era stank, and not just a little. It was a time when perfume wasn't used to seduce, it was used to disguise. The smell of unbathed bodies, clothes washed with urine, spit on the carpet, feces beneath the floorboards, and sour breath was as common as afternoon tea. The appearance was flawless, but the environment putrid. Today, people romanticize that era with elegant dances and refined courts, but even the aristocrats avoided getting close to one another because of the smell. It was a world where glamour coexisted with pus, and where silence concealed practices so unsanitary they would now be considered public health crimes. The real story of Victorian hygiene begins with a shock. Beauty existed only on the surface. Beneath it, there was disgust. And if you, like me, enjoy real stories that challenge what the books tell us, subscribe now so you don't miss the next chapters. And let me know in the comments which country you're watching from. I always read them. You'll see that behind every flawless hairstyle was a head crawling with lice, and every velvet curtain hid secrets that even the strongest noses couldn't withstand. True nobility in the Victorian era wasn't about knowing how to waltz, it was about surviving your own stench. In the Victorian mindset, hygiene wasn't synonymous with health, it was seen as a risk. Many doctors of the time argued that frequent baths weakened the nerves, loosened the muscles, and worst of all, allowed disease to enter through open pores. So, the less contact with water, the better. In noble mansions, it was believed that perfume was enough to replace any need for soap. Ladies used lavender-scented handkerchiefs to clean their faces and armpits. Among the poor, bathing was rare and communal. In worker villages, a single wash basin served the whole household. The father used it first, then the mother, the children in order of age, and finally, the baby. By the end, that water wasn't cleaning. It was a broth of filth. Children grew up without understanding the concept of daily bathing. Women went to their weddings without ever having washed their entire bodies. And many, even in the prime of adulthood, had never fully submerged themselves in clean water. It was a time when sweat was constant, odor was the norm, and filth became invisible to eyes trained to ignore it. If bathing was already taboo, dental care was nearly a myth reserved for the upper class. The idea of regular oral hygiene was out of reach for most people. Instead of toothpaste, there was improvisation and a lot of pain. Whole families used whatever they had on hand to try to clean their teeth: powdered charcoal, fireplace ashes, ground brick, or even toast burned to coal, then crushed with stones. These abrasive substances removed not only grime, but also tooth enamel. Over the years, teeth became fragile, chipped and hollow. 12-year-olds already had inflamed gums and dark gaps between teeth. Adults under 30 often smiled with their mouths shut, if they could still smile at all. But the worst part wasn't cosmetic, it was the pain. Pain that started as a sharp sting and turned into fever, swelling, and infections that could last for weeks. And when the agony became unbearable, there was only one solution: extraction. No anesthesia, no medical expertise. The poor turned to the local barber, who, with the same hands that trimmed beards and cut hair, would pull molars with rusty pliers. The most unfortunate ones were handed over to the blacksmith, who used heavy tongs made for metal, not human bone. The procedure was brutal. Often the tooth would break in half, leaving parts of the root embedded in the gum, worsening the inflammation. Screams echoed through the alleyways. Blood spilled not only from mouths, but from the eyes of those who watched. Death by oral infection was not uncommon. Without antibiotics, a botched extraction could lead to sepsis in days. Some died silently in stuffy rooms, clutching their faces with wet rags. Others, if lucky, survived, but lost all their teeth. And then came a new problem: how to hide the emptiness. The makeshift dentures were grotesque. The wealthy used ivory teeth, the more vain imported porcelain prosthetics, but the poor, they made plates out of polished wood, or in darker cases used real teeth, pulled from corpses. Yes, there was an underground market for human teeth extracted from fallen soldiers or unidentified bodies. It was the dentition of death placed into living gums. Even among the elite, keeping teeth was a struggle. Many aristocrats used whitening powders containing mercury or sulfuric acid, destroying the enamel for the sake of a whiter smile. Appearance mattered more than health, and the result was a Victorian paradox. The more impeccable the outfit, the more rotten the breath. From today's perspective, all of this seems medieval, but it was simply daily life in a society that pretended to be elegant while rotting from within, literally. The mouth of the Victorian era was not made of beautiful words, but of pain, desperation, and a silence suffocated by shame. At the heart of Victorian homes, behind lace curtains and piano rooms, there was one space no one ever showed: the laundry room. There, the brightness of white sheets came at an unthinkable cost, and it came from chamber pots. Human urine, collected over the week, was poured into large barrels and left to ferment until it turned into a thick, yellowish, corrosive liquid. The laundresses, almost always poor women, would plunge their arms up to the elbows in this natural soap. The ammonia in urine was strong. Bed linens, undergarments, even elite shirts were soaked for hours until they lightened. But the process left invisible marks, and others that were very visible. The laundress's hands would swell, crack, and burn for days. The smell clung to their skin, their hair, even their breath. Some women fainted from intoxication. Others with open infections kept working anyway, because refusing meant hunger. Those who endured this dirty job belonged to an invisible class, ignored by the novels of the time. They had children, pain, and a dignity they had to swallow whole. And even knowing they were slowly being poisoned by their work, they returned every week to the fetid buckets where the clothes of clean people were purified by hands no one wanted to touch. The cruelest part was the irony. While ladies flaunted their bleached gowns at balls, believing they looked flawless, they never imagined that their pure white had come at the cost of someone else's sweat and blood, someone who didn't even have the right to use soap. It was elegance built on wounds, literally, and for those women who labored in the cold, the exhaustion, and the acid of their own people, there were no portraits, no historical records, only silence and the smell. If the smell of the Victorian laundry was already terrifying, that of the hair wasn't far behind. In an age without accessible cosmetics, hair care was a real experiment, and often a disaster. Without shampoos or liquid soaps, people turned to kitchen ingredients: vinegar, black tea, rum, beer, and above all, raw eggs. The most popular recipe seemed simple. Crack 2 or 3 eggs directly onto the scalp, rub vigorously until a light foam formed, then rinse with cold water. But reality rarely followed the plan. If the water was even slightly warm, something common in homes that heated water over stoves, the result was immediate and grotesque. Egg whites and yolks would cook in the strands, forming solid clumps stuck to the roots. It was like using an omelette instead of conditioner. And the smell, sour, rancid, penetrating. Even after several rinses, the odor lingered, especially when mixed with apple cider vinegar, another natural solution used to add shine. The result was an acidic scent that attracted flies and other insects to the head, creating an unbearable sensory experience on hotter days. The wealthier tried to mask the problem with herbal infusions or drops of aromatic oils like lavender and lemon. But those items were expensive and rare. For most people, it came down to whatever was left in the kitchen, and when there weren't even eggs, they used fermented rice water or shavings of hardened soap. Nothing that truly cleaned, just something to hide the smell for a few hours. In addition, hair was rarely cut. Women kept it long by tradition, which made the buildup of dirt, grease, and residue even worse. Lice were a silent epidemic. constant itching, open sores on the back of the neck, and nits hiding in the most elegant hairstyles were details the official portraits never showed. This shift in the beauty routine of the Victorian era reveals that appearance was always a mask. Behind the well-groomed locks was a suffering scalp, and hair care, which today represents self-care and freshness, back then meant risk, improvisation, and silent shame. The dirt didn't just stay on the body, it was carried in the fabrics, and there was no piece more dangerous than Victorian dresses. Long, heavy, and full of layers, they didn't just hinder movement, they were walking traps for disease. Women of the time, as they walked through the streets, dragged their skirts over filthy sidewalks where food scraps, horse manure, and human waste accumulated. All this contamination was brought straight into the house, into tea rooms, into children's bedrooms. The dress, a symbol of elegance, became an invisible vector of epidemics. But the danger didn't come only from the streets. Inside the body itself, the clothing also did damage. The constant use of corsets, rigid bodices made of iron or wood, altered the structure of a woman's torso. The lower ribs were compressed until they deformed, and organs like the liver and lungs were displaced. Women had trouble breathing, eating, laughing. Getting pregnant while wearing a tight corset was a sentence of suffering, and even so, it was mandatory. Fainting became so frequent, it turned into part of a woman's charm. Every respectable lady was expected to have a fan at hand, not just to ease the heat, but to try to stay conscious during crowded parties and stifling ballrooms. Expressions like fainting damsel or female weakness were born from this absurd reality, where women literally collapsed because they couldn't breathe. In extreme cases, ribs cracked. There are reports of women who died from something as simple as climbing stairs or dancing for too long. Some lost babies during pregnancy due to internal pressure. Doctors of the time began to raise alarms about the risks, but their voices were drowned out by fashion and by social expectations. Victorian vanity didn't allow comfort. The slimmer the waist, the more respected the woman. The fuller the skirt, the more noble she appeared. And the more tortured the look, the more admired she became. It was a perverse system, where pain was mistaken for beauty and health for vulgarity. So day after day, women dressed to die, slowly, in silence. And even when the body was showing signs of collapse, keeping up with fashion was more important than survival. The fabric was a sentence, and the seamstress's needle, more often than not, felt like a weapon in the hands of aesthetic tyranny. While the body suffered from filth on the outside, another more insidious threat was spreading through the skin, coming from elegant bottles and expensive perfumes. The obsession with whiteness, eternal youth, and a pure appearance led thousands of Victorian men and women to apply poison directly to their faces every day. Pharmacy shelves gleamed with finely decorated glass bottles labeled elixirs of youth or porcelain creams. Their ingredients: white lead, arsenic, mercury, and bismuth. The initial results were enchanting. The skin looked lighter, blemishes disappeared, and the cheeks took on a smooth tone. But the cost came soon after. Just a few months of use were enough for the first symptoms to appear. Hair began to fall out in clumps, hands trembled when holding a teacup. Skin that was once admired turned grey, scaly, and quietly decayed. Young women began to lose their vision. Men, desperate to hide baldness with arsenic-based hair tonics, developed scalp lesions that never healed. And even with their bodies deteriorating, no one dared stop. Vanity was stronger than fear. And the manufacturers, owners of respected pharmacies, members of private clubs, sponsors of elite balls, denied any responsibility. When the first lawsuits reached the courts, they laughed. They claimed the symptoms came from food, the weather, or female hysteria. In 1872, the case of Elizabeth Turnley nearly broke the silence. She was only 24 when she was hospitalized with deep wounds on her face and partial paralysis. Her diary, recovered by her family, revealed that she used a cream called Pure Pearl Tonic every day. sold as royalty's beauty secret. The product contained a high concentration of lead. The manufacturer's trial attracted media attention, but with money and influence, he was acquitted for lack of conclusive scientific evidence. Cases like Elizabeth's multiplied. Doctors began publishing articles warning of the dangers. But society's response was cold. Women were expected to accept the consequences of beauty, and men who used hair restorers with arsenic were considered too vain to deserve sympathy. So the poison kept being sold, now with even more sophisticated labels. It was a luxury to die slowly, as long as the mirror smiled back. Justice tried to act, but you can't arrest a collective ideal. The illusion of purity, youth, and perfection was more powerful than any sentence. And the poison trade survived, supported by money, perfume, and advertising. When the sun set over London's filthy alleys, fear began to spread, not of thieves, but of the air. Yes, the air. For Victorian society, the greatest threat to health was stench. Belief in the miasma theory was almost religious. If it smelled bad, it could kill. Entire hospitals were disinfected with tar smoke. Sulfur was burned in room corners to drive out death. Strong floral scents, camphor, and even turpentine essence were sprayed on pillows. And doctors, they walked the halls with vinegar-soaked cloths covering their noses. They believed the smell of sewage, decay, and the sweat of the poor carried diseases in invisible molecules. It was common to see upper-class ladies always carrying scented handkerchiefs, not out of vanity, but sheer terror. They held them to their faces when passing markets, garbage carts, or beggars. Some even had lavender sachets sewn into their corsets to purify the air around the heart. Walking through the streets after dark was seen as a deadly risk, because as the air cooled, the smell rose, and the lungs became exposed to death. In 1858, the panic reached its peak with the event known as the Great Stink. The Thames River, turned into an open sewer, gave off such an unbearable odour that Parliament had to suspend its sessions. Lawmakers hung vinegar-soaked sheets on the windows and fled the city in search of clean air. But behind all the aromatic hysteria, an ignored truth was growing beneath their feet. The problem wasn't the smell, it was what caused the smell. Human waste dumped in rivers, decomposing animal corpses, burst sewers. All of it created a deadly brew where bacteria thrived. But since the word bacteria was still unknown to most, the focus remained on perfume. The miasma theory delayed sanitation efforts for decades. While the poor died of cholera, typhoid, and dysentery, the elite preferred to invest in more perfume, more incense, more florals in the parlors. It was easier to silence the stench than face its source. Only with the work of doctors like John Snow, who demonstrated that cholera spread through contaminated water, did the paradigm begin to shift. But the idea that smell could kill lingered for a long time. And to this day, in some customs, it still breathes. What the Victorian era taught the world is that ignoring the cause and masking the effects never saves anyone. But fear, it always finds perfume to hide behind. It was impossible to ignore. Even among the heavy tapestries and gleaming chandeliers, the smell rose through the floorboards. In Victorian homes, even the most elegant ones, the bathroom wasn't a separate room with plumbing and privacy. It was a hole, literally. And often, that hole was located right inside the house, in the middle of the living room or behind the kitchen. The so-called water closet was a technical advancement on paper. In practice, waste fell directly into underground pits built beneath the floor. There was no modern plumbing or drainage. These pits filled up over days, weeks, months, until they overflowed. When it rained heavily or the pit reached its limit, the content, soaked with urine and feces, rose back up, flooding bedrooms, hallways, and in extreme cases, exploded from the pressure of accumulated methane gas. That's when the most forgotten and most essential characters of the Victorian era stepped in, the night soil men. They worked only at night To avoid scandalizing the neighbors with the sight and smell, they carried shovels, buckets, and courage. They were paid to descend into the putrid pits, fill barrels with human waste, and drag them through dark streets to dumping sites outside the city. There was no protective gear, no masks, no gloves. Many fell ill. Some, less lucky, fainted from the gases and fell into the very pits they were cleaning and didn't come back out. Dying, swallowed by others' filth, was more common than one might think. Despite the disgust and social contempt, these workers prevented entire neighborhoods from being consumed by their own filth. Without them, the sickly elite, the merchants, the artists, and even the doctors would have drowned, literally, in the consequences of their denial. Over time, public protests and the rise of epidemics forced the British government to invest in a modern sewage system. The engineer, Joseph Bazalgette, was responsible for redesigning London beneath the surface, creating enormous tunnels that still form the foundation of the city's sanitation system today. But the irony remains, the sanitation revolution only happened when the rich began to smell it. When the nobility's dinners were interrupted by the acidic stench of ruptured cesspools, when aristocratic babies began to fall ill without explanation, only then did the digging begin. For decades, the Victorian bathroom was a symbol of denial, a hole that hid what no one wanted to see, and it took houses nearly drowning in their own filth for the most powerful empire of the time to admit that hygiene isn't a luxury, nor a moral choice. It's survival. The horror didn't arrive with screams or blood, it came with the smell. And it was that smell in the summer of 1858 that tore down Britain's wall of denial. London, once proud of its imperial grandeur, was brought to its knees by an invisible and unbearable enemy. The Thames, the river that cut through the capital, had become a thick soup of human excrement. Butcher's blood, animal corpses, and raw sewage dumped without restraint. The heat made it worse. The banks evaporated rot. The smell entered through stained glass church windows, filled hospital corridors, and seeped through the walls of elegant mansions. Inside Parliament, politicians tried to continue their sessions using vinegar-soaked sheets on the windows and scented handkerchiefs over their faces. But it was useless. The city was inhaling its own decay. They called it the Great Stink. A name almost comical for something that bordered on urban apocalypse. Doctors warned of epidemics. Merchants fled the city. Elite families sent their children to the countryside. Newspapers reported daily that the stench was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Faced with the crisis, the British government was forced to act. The solution didn't come from moral decrees or public charity. It came from engineering. Parliament hastily approved funding for an ambitious project, the construction of an underground sewer network capable of cleaning London from the inside out. The man in charge was Joseph Bazalgette, a visionary engineer who designed massive tunnels, sewage interceptors, and pumping stations, many of which are still in use today. The historical irony is brutal. For decades, the elite pretended not to see. While the poor drowned in diseases caused by lack of sanitation, the aristocracy chose to believe that bad smell was a moral issue, not a physical one. Only when that smell invaded their own castles did the problem become urgent. The Great Stink became a turning point, both literal and symbolic. It marked the end of the Victorian illusion that outer beauty was enough. From that point forward, the modern idea of public hygiene, basic sanitation, and collective responsibility began to take shape. London nearly suffocated to learn how to breathe again. Now that the dust has been shaken off and the truth laid bare, tell me honestly, could you survive in a time where perfume masked rot, luxury hid disease, and vanity cost lives? The Victorian era didn't smell like roses. It reeked of denial, ignorance, and suffering. If stories like this help you see the past with new eyes, subscribe now to the channel and turn on notifications. And get ready, because the next video will reveal another historical truth that few dare to tell.